Welcome to the Sensible Socialist Podcast, a podcast for the rational left.
We need to unite and work together if we're all going to get through this. Sounds like socialism to me.
The amount of people I see talking about socialism positively is actually staggering.
Do you think, do you really think that a proletarian revolution is just around the corner in America?
Grab your pitchforks and stab your mayor.
Your hero, Obama.
He's not my hero. I'm
heroic he comes
idiot. If Bernie Sanders were president, right, and he wanted to bring the same ideas as for socialism into this country, do you think that we would benefit?
Yeah.
But I just told you Venezuela's eating rats.
But I just want people to have health care. I don't want,
Same thing Hugo Chavez.
Oh my god. You people have, worms in your brain, honestly.
Welcome to this episode of the Sensible Socialist Podcast, a podcast for the rational left. In this episode, I talked to your host and comrade, Brett O'Shea of Rev Left Radio. Brett and I used to sort of be in the same circles on social media, and we're talking about socialist and communist issues. And I've been a follower of Rev Left Radio and a listener for a long time, and I was actually just humbled that Brett reached out to me and said he had listened to one of the episodes and really enjoyed it, and if I wanted to have a conversation with him, that we should have one. And so I think it was just a great opportunity to be able to talk to him. We had a great conversation, and I want you to have a listen to it. So without further ado, here's my conversation with Brett O'Shea. So, Brett, welcome to the Sensible Socialist Podcast.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. I am extremely excited to be here. And the way that I try to basically just start off with everybody to kind of lay a groundwork that I think that a lot of people are curious about, as a way of sort of introducing yourself. Can you give us a bit of a background about just, who you are, but really about how you kind of got interested in socialism and sort of leftist ideas?
Sure, yeah. I always grew up working class. It's always been a deal for me, right? Like growing up in the lower echelons of the working class, seeing my parents, go to work every day, but still struggle to get by. I lived in a very sort of small house on my mom's side, my mom and my stepdad. On my dad's side, he got into, briefly as a child, I guess he was into selling drugs very heavily and got pretty big at one point.
All right.
So my first interactions with police is me getting up to go to second grade and them, kicking in all the doors and swarming the house. At another time, a few years later, I saw a bunch of cops come and basically just beat my dad up on the front porch, and I saw the bruises and stuff afterwards. So that mixture of just seeing police brutality against my father, and then my mom's side being very low, working class and struggling constantly, it was always a tension inside of myself. What does this all mean? And when I started forming a social or political consciousness in my mid to later teens, the two options you're given is liberalism and conservatism. I naturally engaged with that, found both to be lacking. And I'm not exactly sure how I eventually came across Marxism and stuff, but I do remember as a teenager coming across, I think it was the Communist Manifesto.
Sure.
And just even though it was incomprehensible, 99% of it was incomprehensible to me. I felt something for the first time, even just hearing the words working class being said so much, that was so new to me. And so it just, from there, it was developing. I had a kid at a young age. I had my first child at age 19.
Wow.
That compelled me to I was working at a gas station then. And I was like, oh shit, I really got to provide for my daughter coming into this world. And so I was like, you know what? You got to get into college. That's what we're told from day one. You got to have a college degree or else you're going to, be screwed.
Yep.
And so I did that, eventually went through a philosophy program. And then found, more formal instruction of Marxism, more formal sort of philosophical German idealists stuff, so it all sort of coming together.
Sure.
And then, and ever since then, it's just been really me deepening my understanding of Marxism and then trying to turn around and help other people understand it. Because Marxism, it's incredibly complex. I've been studying it, off and on for well over a decade now. I'm 30. And still, constantly, there's entire arguments within the Marxist tradition that I haven't even begun to address. There's entire, sort of spin-offs of Marxism that I still don't know much about. So even after a decade of pretty intense study, you're still constantly learning. And so I think that also attracts people that are more intellectually inclined, just because of the enormity of the philosophical project of Marxism. Sure. and the never-ending sort of work you can do learning about it. But importantly, you have to marry that as well to some organizational praxis. But yeah, so pretty much that's how I got there.
Right on. I'm curious about some of the activism stuff that you've done. I mean, I think I know I've seen a few things about work that you've done. What are some of the experiences that you've had actually organizing in the sort of leftist space?
Yeah, for a long time, being as I am born and raised here in Omaha, Nebraska, for a long time I really didn't know that there was any networks of like active socialist or communists doing any organizing work. And I mean, I'm sure they did exist, but they weren't prevalent or whatever, and it was harder to find. This was, 10 years ago or something. So sure. I remember like joining the DSA as like a 20-something, like 20, 21 years old, because I was like, well, if I can't organize here, at least I can pay this organization my dues and maybe they'll do something good. I joined the IWW and was really just trying to like find something, and then if at the very least pay dues so that I could help that organization grow or something. Mm-hmm. But after the Trump election specifically, huge protests in downtown Omaha, as there were in most major cities across the country. And I really came into contact for the first time through the online as well as through like just street protests. People that I was like, oh shit, born and raised in Omaha as well, and they're all like communists and anarchists. And we got together, after the election of Trump, and we was like, we have to organize. We have to do something like this fascist threat. First and foremost, we had active Nazis in Omaha at that time. Sure. We have to deal with it. And yeah, so Rev Left Radio actually came out of those early organizing days after the Trump election, because we were trying to figure out a way to address the need for political education in our community. So Rev Left Radio was initially sort of thought of as like a local, sort of maybe even regional thing where we would just keep each other intact, maybe talk about basic principles and try to help the political education side of organizing. But obviously it took off, it became national and then international, and took us all by surprise. But that was really the core organizing that gave rise to the show. But then to this day, Nebraska Left Coalition, I'm a co-founder of. We just started our free vaccine program. We got a couple nurses joining the organization this summer, and so awesome. We finally launched this free vaccine drive for poor and working people in our community. And then, co-founder of the Socialist Rifle Association, which I'm pretty sure you're also a member of. Is that correct?
Me?
Are you? Yeah.
I'm not formally a member of anything like that, but I am in spirit in solidarity with
absolutely
the whole thing. I mean, being from the Midwest, I'm originally from Minnesota.
Oh, nice.
So that's the sort of, I've taken my fair share of gun safety and understand the importance of needing the ability to have that kind of technical skill, say that, when a certain situation could arise that would necessitate that kind of skill. And so I'm would fully endorse the Socialist Rifle Squad. And
awesome.
So yeah, I would not say I'm a formal member, but I should look into it.
Yeah, I think actually I got it confused because I have another comrade named Kevin from Minnesota, so maybe that was the confusion.
Really? Okay. Yeah.
But anyway,
it's a common name.
Yeah. As is Brett. But the SRA, and then I'm also sort of tangentially related to these comrades that are in the Omaha Tenants United organization, and they're spearheading gentrification problems in our community by trying to organize tenants against their shitty ass landlords.
Wow, yeah, so, right on. Which is a common struggle throughout the whole country. That's in some ways what I was doing a lot in Minnesota, was working with Occupy Homes, which had come out of which was sort of the best part of the Occupy movement. Was doing really good, anti-eviction things and things like that.
I remember there's like a local rap scene, rhyme sayers and stuff in Minnesota, and I remember like Brother Ali being arrested outside of one of those Occupy.
Absolutely, and Ginger Jensen, who ran for city council with Socialist Alternative, was part of that, stuff like that. So there's a long tradition of organizing in that space and then moving out to bigger and sort of better things. So
hell yeah.
It's interesting, the common struggles, housing being a big issue, especially in the wake of 2008.
Absolutely.
It's a way to put the money where your mouth is and actually organize on the ground.
For sure.
But tell us a little bit more about Rev Left Radio before we kind of get into the meat of what I wanted to talk to you about. Just like you kind of mentioned that how it started a bit, but like tell us what it's become.
Yeah. So Rev Left Radio, started off as I said as like a local political education thing, but expanded rapidly. There's obviously a deep desire for some real far left, honest stuff in the podcasting world, which up until that point there were a few. But a lot of the quote-unquote left-wing podcasts you'd interact with were pretty much all left liberal or progressive, many of which are still like sort of around today, which they're not terrible, but they just weren't as far left as some people are obviously wanting to go.
Right.
So that kind of took off when people saw that there was somebody out there putting in that sort of work. And it just expanded, it's really hard to sort of like take stock of it as it's happening. You can sort of look back retrospectively and be like, wow, I can't believe that happened. But more than anything, Rev Left Radio was really focused on sort of talking about theory. We understand that theory is an important element of praxis. It's the guiding hand of meaningful praxis. And then I also really wanted to cover proletarian history, right? Which will always involve sort of setting the record straight on like key proletarian figures from the past. Like we did an episode debunking the myths and lies about Che Guevara, that he was this sociopathic, homophobic monster or whatever. We systematically just deconstruct that stuff. And so, we started off like doing tendency episodes too, like, just having a guest on that represented whether it's anarchism or Marxism-Leninism or even like anarcho-primitivism, and just like sort of educating people about all these different places on the radical left and how they interact and how they're connected and how they're related throughout history and through theory. And so, that's pretty much Rev Left. And then we have a spin-off sister podcast called Red Menace. I wanted to do a project specifically focused on explicating and reflecting on actual political theory. So me and my co-host Allison Escalante, we do Red Menace together, and that is where we read texts by like Lenin and Marx and Mao and explain them to our listeners and then reflect on them and all of that. So those are the two shows that we run here.
Right on. Well, that last one I think is really important. I mean, I recently, after being with Socialist Alternative and things like that for a little while, took a break and kind of said, I have to go back and reacquaint myself with the theory, and so went through the like Marx Engels Reader and had that experience that you explained too, where you kind of like, wow, I remember reading this, 10 years ago and being really stoked about it, and now I read it now and I'm like, I didn't realize half of what was in this.
Exactly.
Like, there's so much important stuff, and I remember a few things clicking last time, and more has clicked this time. And one of the recent episodes of this was I literally just read Engels' Socialism, Utopian, and Scientific, because I think it's perfect. I just think it's one of the best things that you could read, especially as an introduction, just sort of like, what does all this mean? Because it's so well put, and I think for all of Marx's genius, Engels was, I think, a much better writer.
Yeah, he was a systematizer. He took all his like ideas and his writings throughout his life and tried to systematize it into something more coherent and formal. And so he really did Marxism a service by doing it. And that's funny you say that, because that text by Engels was, I think, the first text we read on Red Menace. So we both agree that it's foundational. Yeah,
absolutely. I think it's if nothing else, that's where I would direct someone.
For sure.
What I wanted to talk to you about, originally I was like, I just want to talk to you about like the podcast and podcasting on the left. But I think why I started this podcast was in some ways, I think, similar to how you kind of described, as just being a part of educating people who may not be familiar with these ideas and present them in a way that they're sort of used to and that isn't foreign, that is sort of, able to be listened to and understood by the regular person. And the goal of that ultimately is to, for me, raise class consciousness. And so I assume that's the ultimate sort of goal that you have too, is like this ultimate raising of consciousness generally, I think ultimately into class consciousness, but like the raising of class consciousness. And so I wonder how you see the role of class consciousness generally, and like how you see it fit in terms of the general Marxist philosophy.
Yeah, great question. So class consciousness in this context is really more or less synonymous with what I was saying earlier about political education. The need to politically educate from a left-wing perspective will mean the emphasis of the role that class plays in sort of structuring our daily lives and structuring our relationship to wealth and power. So class is the sort of fundamental constitutive force of capitalism, right? Capitalism is a class society. People are broken down among classes, and there's like a sort of hierarchy of wealth and power that goes along with that. So the role of raising class consciousness in Marxist philosophy, the role of just class consciousness in general, is to get past the sort of bourgeois mystification, and we'll get to ideology in a bit where we will talk more about that. But to get past this bourgeois liberal sort of attempt to not make you think of yourself as a member of a certain class in a hierarchy, but we hear this stuff all the time, like to really be like, oh, the American family, we're one big family, we got to stick together, and like to take that class consciousness and prevent it from arising by placing on top of it a sort of nationalist identity and an identity with whatever bourgeois nation state you happen to be born into. To apprehend class society and one's place within it is a necessary step to understand the theory, and then ultimately, in order to generate the praxis needed for the working class to be able to stand up on its own, demand whatever it is we demand, etc. That takes organization, but before you can get to there, you have to raise class consciousness, people's conception of themselves as a member of a certain class in a longer historical unfolding. And I think that's what class consciousness does. That's the role it plays ultimately in Marxist philosophy.
Yeah, so how would you, if you were sort of, really bringing somebody into this for the first time, how would you describe to them what a class is and the role of class in their lives?
Well, it's interesting because class on one hand is so obvious, but on the other hand, it's so often sort of submerged by our conditioning, sort of, through this fog of mystification. We sort of don't really, especially in America, like
in America.
Yeah, Europe has a different sort of relationship to class. It's the working class knows itself as the working class much more than the United States does, and that's for a bunch of complicated cultural and historical reasons. Not least of which, you talk about the Cold War, etc. But yeah, so what was your question again? Just so
how do you define class to somebody who is not familiar with the sort of Marxist conception of it?
So yeah, just using regular words to talk to somebody it's very easy to convey to them what a class is. Like imagine talking to your coworker. You're already talking to somebody and everything around you is class structured. If you have a family member that wakes up and goes to work every day, clocks in and gets a paycheck and has a boss, they understand on some level what class they are in. And so just talking about those basic realities, like, you have to go in, you have to answer to a boss, you don't own any property, you don't own any business, you instead, because you don't have the money to buy the property to own a business, you have to rent out your body, more or less, to make somebody else rich through profits. And the only way that a boss can really get what we know as profits is by extracting some surplus value that's been created throughout the process of you and your coworkers' work, right? The actual toil that generates the value in the first place. So it's weird when you talk. If you get too jargony, it can be sort of alienating and confusing.
Right.
But really, it's so simple. It only takes the most simplest words to convey to somebody.
Exactly. Like in some ways, just how do you relate to your job? Do you own it and employ people, or do you work at it and get a paycheck?
Right. So
that's in some ways as basic as it can get.
Yeah.
And it's amazing that that's not more well understood, because it is such a simple concept at the end of the day.
Yeah.
So the other part of this is the sort of raising of the consciousness part of it, and sort of as a way of talking about the kind of consciousness that we're talking about with class consciousness, is that you hear there's been this taking of the idea of raising consciousness that's been used in feminist circles and in civil rights circles, specifically black civil rights movements. And how does this class consciousness differ from what one might call sort of wokeness, or these other forms of consciousness raising that would apply in places other than sort of class consciousness?
Sure. Yeah, so just to understand the role that consciousness plays in class consciousness, like for Marx, consciousness describes a person's political sense of self, like your awareness of your own existence in history, in the Marxist sense, and in the class structure. So to understand yourself as a member of the working class, and to understand a sort of historical lineage that you come from based on the rise of capitalism and the fall of feudalism, etc., that will give you that broadening, that historical awareness of where you stand in that trajectory. So that's the role that consciousness plays. And the idea of, as you were asking, how does it conflict with like ideas of wokeness or other forms of consciousness raising? Well, it's a few different answers to this. Like there are forms of like quote unquote consciousness raising or raising awareness that can be benign. Like we're raising awareness of this specific disease or this specific illness, and we're going to do it by whatever, doing a social media thing or going and waving placards on the side of the road, etc. But class conflict, to understand your own class position, it's an inherent challenge to the way that things are, because the moment people become conscious of their class position, they become conscious of the exploitation that their class suffers at the hand of another class. So in any liberal capitalist society, any class society, especially a very powerful one in the imperial core like the United States, there will always be an attempt to paper over the class dynamics, to paper over the contradictions between class, and to replace that class consciousness with a nationalist one, as I said earlier, national identity. When we talk about wokeness, I think what we're really getting at is something like liberal identity reductionism, which is a sort of attempt to disavow class and replace it with one's identity. This presents a bunch of problems, not least of which, how do you build solidarity across disparate identities without a class basis to unite and have that solidarity? And so you see that wokeness or liberal identity reductionism often just takes the form of, debates. I don't want to be too pejorative here, but the idea of like the oppression Olympics and be like, you don't talk because I have this set of identities and you only have these set of identities. Therefore, shut the fuck up and listen to me talk, etc.
Yeah,
and it's just spinning its wheels. There's no sense of solidarity being built. There's no attempt to unify people across differences. There's just the reification of difference and the sort of impossibility of bridging that gap. Because if you take seriously that class isn't important and identity is the central thing, well, then there's no mechanism at all to unite around, to unite through that. There's just like, I have this identity battering ram and you have yours, and we hit each other over the head all day.
Right. And that's the best thing about the thing that's really advantageous about the class dynamic is that it is a inherently uniting thing, that it is something that cross-cuts all of the other identities that one has, because everyone in some ways has a relationship to production.
Right.
And so it's one of those things that it cuts through. Like I've always, the irony of the talk of intersectionality, because to me it's always been this notion that the class is that sort of intersection, that, that all of those connect back to this underlying class conflict, this sort of class struggle that is the brew in which all of these individual expressions based on identity and things like that sort of have their expression. So, to kind of the way I always see it too, especially in terms of how something like a post-racial society or something like that, to me, the only possibility of any existent post-racial society has as its existing point the necessary condition of a sort of socialist transformation of society. Exactly. Because without that, I just don't see how you're ever going to. You can raise consciousness about the racial history of the United States and the history of white supremacy, and that's not wrong to do so, but it doesn't lead itself to having a fundamental plan at which to tackle them, because it doesn't also ultimately include a fundamental change in society, which is what we would talk about in the sort of Marxist tradition. Exactly right. And the way that cashes out politically is usually in the form of a representative from an identity group being lifted up into the echelons of the ruling class of power, and then that being synonymous with the progress of the entire group. You can think of Barack Obama, you can think of Jay-Z, you can think of Hillary Clinton, right? Hillary Clinton, is this imperial war hawk that bombs women all over the world, but yet, her rise to possibly be president was supposed to be seen by these liberal identity reductionists as synonymous with like a feminist revolution, and that all women were benefiting from this. And so earlier when I'm talking about mystification, that's one way that it occurs, is like, if I just vote for the woman, then women are, if she wins the election, then women are doing good overall. But meanwhile, she just, standing over the same old capitalist and imperialist devastation that, bears the brunt, obviously, I think mostly on women, specifically women in the global South. And so, feminism, if it's not for everybody, if it's just for rich white women in the imperial core, then it's not really feminism. And that's a problem. On the other side, though, really quick,
the other error on the far other side is class reductionism, and that does happen sometimes, which is to say that your identities and the different sites of oppression don't matter at all. All that matters is class. That's also an error. The middle ground is to say identities matter. They shape people's daily experiences, and they sort of reify the sites of oppression that they have to face. If you're, a black trans woman, you're going to face a lot more shit on a daily basis and have a lot more structural impediments to your success than I, as a white cis man, will have. So we have to simultaneously understand the role that identity plays in our lives. But as we said earlier, that I think you and I agree, it's the class part that allows us to say, yes, you're very different from me. I can never fully know your experiences, but we both have the same relationship to the ruling class. And so that gives us some path forward to unite and move together as one. Absolutely. That's exactly the way that I see it. And I completely agree with you on that. And so it leads me to the next thing that I wanted to ask you about, which is just the difference between, Marx didn't really use this whole idea of class consciousness, but there's a distinction he makes in terms of the class in itself, which is the sort of class as it exists as a relationship in production. And then there's the class for itself, which is the sort of the class that is self-conscious of itself and pursuing its own interest. And there's a clear distinction between those two, because I think, as a lot of people see around this, especially the United States today, you have a serious amount of people, the vast majority of people are wage laborers and have that relationship to production where they are employees, but they are not organized in active pursuit of their own interests as a class. And so I'm wondering what you think is some of the reasons behind this, especially in the United States. Yeah. And I think this is sort of unique to the global north, and specifically the imperial core countries, right? Like, you definitely still see this acknowledgement of class throughout the global south. You definitely see, you have Marxist communist uprisings in India and the Philippines, all throughout the global south. And so, the class distinctions are more pronounced there, because they're not only sort of class distinctions within a society itself, but they're on the bottom part of the global hierarchy created by global capitalism and imperialism. So it really is sort of in the imperial core that we see this sort of depoliticization or this confusion around people's understanding what class they're in and being conscious of it. And we also have a labor aristocracy because of the imperial plunder that comes from being the most powerful capitalist nation state on the planet and being able to siphon and funnel wealth and resources from the global south up to the global north. There's a sort of excess of money in the imperial core that allows the ruling class to more or less sort of buy off certain upper stratas of the working class, and that forms what is known as a labor aristocracy. And again, especially in the United States, it's usually white men that have, are high relative to other working class people still proletariat, right? Still working class, but on the upper echelon of that because of their sort of racial benefits and the benefits of imperialism and white supremacy broadly. And so the machinations of white supremacy and colonialism really go to shape this, and it really works to sort of blur the lines between what classes are. And then we constantly hear this talk, this is part of ideological conditioning, we constantly hear this talk of the middle class. So, both Democrats and Republicans are constantly talking about the middle class, not the working class. And this is subtle, but it does serve an ideological function, which is to say that it pretends that there is such a thing as the middle class, which I guess it goes unstated, but the implicit idea is that it's not the ruling class and it's not those poor working people, right? You're something different. You're aspirational, I say bourgeois adjacent or something like that. And that also sort of, that conditioning gets in a lot of people's minds as well. And so, when you have that conditioning from day one, when you have 40 years of neoliberalism deconstructing like the unions, which used to be a main vehicle through which working class people could come to some level of class consciousness, these things pile up. You have the funneling of wealth and resources from the global south to the global north, so you can sort of move money around a little better. All these things together combine to create this situation where, especially in the imperial core, there's sort of not as much of this organization that we'd like to see. And that's always been a problem that's sort of haunted Marxism. The original, Marxist idea, the orthodox Marxist idea is that socialist revolution would happen in the most advanced industrial capitalist nation and would be led by the advanced industrial proletariat of that nation. In Russia, that didn't happen. In China, that didn't happen. Throughout the global South, that didn't happen. And in fact, almost all countries except for the Western European American imperial core have, at least on some level, dealt with socialist revolutions or socialist movements that are really robust. Now, of course, the Western Europe and America has as well, right? The Black Panther Party in America, the CPUSA throughout the 30s and 40s. These things definitely do exist. But again, after 40 years of neoliberal austerity, particularly, it sort of chips away at even that. So we're at this really sad state of affairs. And then, of course, there's the whole Cold War sort of legacy. That, anything associated with the far left, with socialism, with communism, was seen just by definition as being terrible. And, we're only a generation or two. I mean, I was born in 89. That's the year the Berlin Wall fell, and that's usually the historical marker we think of for the beginning of the end of the Soviet Union, which officially collapsed a year or two later. So I was born right then. So my parents come from the Cold War generation. Their parents come from the Cold War generation. And that ideological conditioning is fucking powerful,
Yeah. So, I mean, you mentioned it at the end there, that sort of ideological conditioning, and for me, I think there's specifically in the United States, a massive an ideology creation mechanism in terms of the public schools and things like that, in terms of sort of creating a ready-made way to understand America, the history of the United States, the role it plays in the world. How do you see is the sort of interplay between what ideology is and its relationship to the creation of or suppression of class consciousness?
Great question. So one way to answer this question would be to talk about the Marxist conception of base and superstructure. So ideology, right? You can think of it in any way you want to think of that term. There's some different definitions of ideology, but no matter how you define ideology, in the Marxist conception of base and superstructure, ideology is a superstructural product of the capitalist economic base, right? The machinations of the mode of production of capitalism structures the entire society, and so the laws and customs and religions and cultural, machinations of that society are going to be shaped by that economic base, and then it turns around to maintain that economic base, right? So then the superstructure turns back on itself and serves to basically maintain the capitalist mode of production. And this is what we say when we talk about ideology, this superstructural element created by capitalism, but also turning around and maintaining it. And it is in part a mystification. There's two different ways you can use ideology. You can use it in like the colloquial way, which just means like any set of ideas. Or you can use it in the more Marxist way, which is almost synonymous with a mystification process, by which there's a gap between how things appear to be and how things really are, and everything in between is sort of foisted upon us by the ideological apparatus of the ruling class. Louis Althusser, for example, is a Marxist philosopher, and he does a lot of work on this, and he came up with the idea of ideological state apparatuses, which is basically, this same thing. These institutions that appear in the superstructure, like schools, for example, using your example, is a perfect example of an ideological state apparatus. A school, without even the teachers or the principal or anybody being conscious of it, right? It's not like people are in a smoke-filled room, like we're going to trick these kids to believe this stupid shit. It's not like that. It functions sort of below the level of consciousness, and every member takes part in it without really oftentimes being aware that they're taking part in it. So even something as seemingly innocuous as making every child stand up from day one and say, I pledge allegiance to the United States of America, starting there through just the way we're taught American history and world history, it all serves to not talk about the reality of those power relations, right? The brutality of colonialism, the separating of the global world into different classes. It can't talk like that. Liberalism will not allow itself to talk like that. So it has to talk about America, the land of the free. We had these forefathers who were really brilliant men, and for the first time ever, they put into practice these ideas, all this dumb shit. But you grow up with that, and you don't have anything challenging that. You're certainly not going to turn on the TV and find any challenges to that narrative. That narrative just becomes internalized as common sense. And that's the perniciousness of this form of ideology, is that it can make you think things and then make you think that it was you that came up with them. and it's pretty intense. Yeah.
It's where it's the underlying basis of that's just the way it is sort of argument, and you know the which is a significant amount of the arguments against any kind of even progressive ideas, much less Marxist ideas, is that you'll have contending ideas of the role of human nature, and how, you know, you have a lot of times there's even scientific endeavors like evolutionary psychology, you know, and certain forms of sociology and all those kinds of things that will sort of reify the existent status quo, the sort of capitalist existing structures, because there needs to be some kind of philosophical, you know, or social veneer that can be put upon this that gives it some kind of rooting and justification. And so there's a whole lot of, you know, philosophizing about these sort of ideas that are attempting to, you know, ground them in something that doesn't seem to just be purely self-serving, but in the end ends up, you know, functioning in that exact way. And I think, you know, you also have the whole idea of that it comes from like Antonio Gramsci on the idea of the cultural hegemony and the perpetuation of ruling class ideas, because the ruling class are the ones who own the production of ideas. And so you combine that the Althusserian idea of the state apparatus and the Gramscian idea of the cultural hegemony of the ruling class elite in terms of, you know, art and culture and media and all of those kinds of things. You combine those together and you have the perfect situation to create an entire you know, a major industrial working class like there exists in the United States, to have what many Marxists, I say, would call false consciousness, that they actually assume the ideology of the ruling class. And we know when we get that famous, but I think somewhat mythological, I don't know who exactly said it, but the whole idea that the reason that socialism never took hold in the United States is because every working class American sees themselves as just a temporarily embarrassed millionaire.
Yep.
And I think that is in some ways the real quick, you know, tweet way of describing the significance and pervasiveness of false consciousness, particularly in the United States. And I think that has to do with, as you sort of mentioned, particularly in the United States, the history of settler colonialism combined with the whole racial dynamic in the United States as a way of, rather than in some like sort of European societies, you have more of this naked class conflict. In the United States, you have a lot of otherwise class conflict being sort of hidden by or diverted by racial conflict. And so you can even have like sort of class solidarity among white people and a lack of class solidarity in terms of racial lines. And it sort of upsets the normal class dynamics, the quote unquote normal class dynamics of a country that doesn't necessarily have the history of, you know, indigenous genocide, settler colonialism, and then race-based chattel slavery. And so the United States, not to mention the whole suppression of you know, radical politics in, you know, multiple times during multiple Red Scares in the history of the United States. That's, I think, one way that you can understand that one way it's amazing that we can even talk about socialism, you know, and have a Bernie Sanders figure as problematic as Bernie Sanders is in the use of socialism, that we can even talk about that, I think is incredible progress compared to how it has been.
Yeah, definitely. And that progress came about largely on the heels of the Great Recession in 2008.
Yes.
And the Occupy movement that sprung up before it. People like, especially younger comrades, like, you know, late teens, early 20s, that weren't fully really adults or even like, you know, teenagers during that time. They sometimes, I think, are even naive of just how alien talking about class was before the recession and Occupy. Like Occupy, if it did anything, brought in this ability to talk about class openly and really paved the way for Bernie to run as a democratic socialist sort of unapologetically. So yeah, whatever your feelings are, and we have plenty of critiques of all of that, there is a sort of one thing leading to another, and that's really challenging this, you know, almost century long Cold War mentality, which is interesting and important, and, you know, we're on the cutting edge of it. Two quick things, though, before we move on to the next question.
Yeah.
I really like how you said justify itself. Ideology is like the sort of ruling class's way of justifying itself. And if it was honest, it would have to say something like, you know, the entire liberal capitalist project is so the ruling class can get as much wealth and resources as possible from its own country and others, and to maintain this class hierarchy, because we, the ruling class, want to continue to live lives of extreme luxury and comfort, and we don't want to be brought down to the level of equal with you, the rabble. And so it can't be honest about that. So it has to dress itself up in like, we believe in freedom and democracy and all this silly stuff. And then the second point is, I talked earlier about this mystification. One thing that Marxism has as an advantage when it comes to ideology is that Marxism fundamentally demystifies these social situations and relations of production, in part by allowing you to have a meta perspective on your own ideas, right? If liberalism is just like this is what is generated by the machinations of liberal capitalist society, and it's sort of, people don't really reflect on it, they don't even have an alternative in most cases. Marxism, just by understanding the base and superstructure and understanding what role ideology plays in maintaining capitalism, gives, and sort of how these ideas come to be in the first place, Marxism gives you a meta perspective on your own ideas. And that, to me, is a huge advantage to not having that meta perspective and just being sort of confined by the ideological conditioning of your epoch,
Yeah, I think it also, in terms of allowing a person to develop a really good bullshit detector and a hefty amount of skepticism. It's really important that almost everything that Marx wrote was always, it had the word critique in it, somewhere. It was the critique of this and the critique of political economy and a critical, ruthless critique of everything existing and all that kind of. So it's very critical. It is the idea that you're attempting to pull back the curtains that have been placed upon these kinds of things, and I think that's it, especially relating it back to in the real philosophical sense. It is the real break from Hegel that Marx represents, is this idea that like what you see so much in Hegel is like these brilliant ideas then masked by so much bullshit and by so much, like you said, mysticism, that the core of what the truth is so hidden by all of these layers of sort of ridiculousness and nonsense and things that don't totally make sense but sound really good in the original German, and so we're going to assume that they're this actually existing thing. And so the whole idea of the turning Hegel on his head is to say, let's recognize what is actually going on here and how these relationships actually function and what they produce. But also, I think, not just negatively in terms of the critique, but the critique also comes with it this underlying notion, if not this explicit saying, that there are vehicles by which we can repair the sort of poor aspects of the current system, the exploitation that's inherent in capitalism and the crises that exist and the consequences of those and all of these sort of negative consequences, that there is this vehicle in the working class that would be able to free society from this sort of dynamic. And so there as much as and I think it's interesting that a lot of people will still acknowledge the Marxist critique, but they will maybe take issue with this idea of the working class being the sort of vehicle for the future, and I think that's an interesting debate, and one of the reasons why you might hear somebody like Slavoj Žižek not say that he's necessarily a Marxist when he's debating with Jordan Peterson about Marxism, but will say that he's a Hegelian. I think maybe because he doesn't see the revolutionary potential of the working class. I didn't necessarily think about asking you this, but what do you think about that? Can the modern working class still be the agent of revolutionary change?
Well, it sort of has to be, right, on one level. What other group of people sort of is institutionalized by the state of affairs that is big enough to challenge the ruling hegemony of the ruling class? Literally, because of the way that class society is structured, the proletariat can really only be that force. It has to be organized. It has to be conscious of itself, as you said, as a class, and it has to understand its historical trajectory and its historical mission, and then carry that out. But if you disavow the fact that the working class, this core contradiction of capitalism between the working class making everything and the bourgeoisie appropriating the value of all those things that the working class makes, I don't see how you can resolve that contradiction by dismissing the revolutionary role that the proletariat must play. It doesn't need to be necessarily the industrialized proletariat in the most advanced industrial capitalist country. I think we've seen through like Maoism, through like Fanon's Wretched of the Earth, this emphasis on the peasantry or this emphasis on the lumpen proletariat shows how maybe in the colonial context things differ a bit. But ultimately, I think that has to be the case, because if we just disavow the proletariat as the mechanism to challenge the ruling class, I don't see what's left. Other than maybe a balkanization of everybody going against everybody, like forming little ideological groups or something, and just having like this sort of all-out war or something. But if we want to build a better world, we have to topple the very economic system that's destroying our planet, and that economic system produces, as Marx would say, its own gravediggers. It produces the exploited proletariat that eventually gets fed up of being exploited and of watching its own planet be destroyed and unites to fight back. It has to fight back along class lines because we live in this class society that has a class hierarchy. And so I'm very suspicious of anybody, like we can talk about the nuances here, but I'm suspicious of anybody who wants to jettison the entire idea that the proletariat is the revolutionary force to overcome capitalism. I don't know.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, in some ways, yeah, you're smart to start with. Well, I don't know who else is going to do it. There seems to be no other force that is stepped into the role. And you sort of also said, I don't know who else could do it. It's the dynamics. A lot of things in modern bourgeois, late stage monopoly finance capitalism is quite different than what Marx saw in London in the 1860s. Mm-hmm. But I think some of the dynamics are still very much there, and I don't think enough has changed where we're in a different situation where this Marxist, the sort of Marxist vision of the role of the revolutionary working class has somehow gone away.
Exactly.
But to go a bit philosophical, I was doing a little bit of research about the idea of class consciousness, and you did say that you studied philosophy, and I studied philosophy too, and so nice. For super uber philosophy nerds, here's a question for you. So George Lucas, not the George Lucas, I think is how you actually say his name, not George Lucas, but he made not the Star Wars guy, but the Marxist philosopher. So he made a point that I want to get your take on in History and Class Consciousness, which is one of the books he wrote, and he said there's a difference between proletarian class consciousness and sort of bourgeois class consciousness because of the way that in the sort of process of history, the proletariat as a class is transformed into a commodity, and that's different in the way that any other sort of class consciousness has been produced, because most of the time the sort of art and culture and production of what we have called ideology has always come in the form of the ruling class, and it's therefore like what you see now, especially in the sort of liberal ideology, is this notion of like subjectivity and individual free will and the sort of responsibility that comes from that. And what Lucas said was that the proletarian class consciousness is different. It's not subjective. It's actually only possibly objective because of its commodification in the relationship of production. The idea that the working class as a whole transforms from the subject an individual into an object, the wage laborer, and that the sort of the act of being conscious of itself as a class is the act of transforming the very structure of objectivity of reality. So what do you think of this sort of analysis of the idea that this commodification is a way of objectification, and this objectification sort of can actually transform the very structure of reality for, I guess, both the individual member of the proletarian class who is themselves class conscious, but actually of the entire class itself?
Yeah, wow. So I have not read Lucas's History and Class Consciousness, but I've been meaning to. So, this will just sort of be like me doing my best having not read the text itself.
Good, that's what everyone wants to hear. Just bullshit a little bit, it's cool.
Absolutely. So, so I really do like this idea that, the working class is commodified. And by commodified, we can think of labor markets, unemployment lines. The labor market is shifted in favor of the employer, or the labor market is shifted in favor of workers. But at the end of the day, it's the ruling class not only commodifying all the products around us, right, buying and selling it on the market, but actually commodifying labor itself to be bought and sold on the market. So that's a very interesting way to think about it, and by the very act of commodifying it, turning it into a sort of object and not into subjectivity. So when it takes consciousness of itself, I don't exactly know how he cashes out this transition, but like how being conscious of itself as a class then goes to transform the structure of objectivity itself. It has to do something with that commodity relationship, I guess, being destroyed or eradicated, sort of rooted out. I'm not quite sure. But I do like the idea, and I would love to hear your thoughts on this too, because I assume you've read the book, or at least more of it than I have. But this idea of bourgeois subjectivity and ideological concepts like individual free will, it goes back even deeper than that. Like if you go into Lockean or Hobbesian liberal philosophies, these social contract theorists, it really is sort of rooted on a sort of pristine individual. Like its starting point is the individual. And then in Hobbes, you talk about the state of nature, and you come together to create the state. In Locke, you talk about the individual putting his labor into something, and then that is why he gets to own it, etc. But it all goes down to individualism, and that bourgeois subjectivity, that fascination and obsession with individualism, sort of has to be there. For various reasons. And I think it sort of escapes the purviews of this conversation to get into all of those reasons. But I do know that this whole idea of individualism is deeply beaten into us, and it manifests that bourgeois subjectivity of hyper-individualism, even manifests in our organizing circles. It manifests in even Occupy Wall Street with this idea that, hey, everybody is a free individual. Nobody does anything without, consenting to doing it in the form of political action. And then there'd have to be unanimous decision-making, horizontal unanimous decision-making. And I had Jody Dean on once, and she talked about going into an Occupy meeting in New York, and somebody saying hey, let's take this park. And then a bunch of people from the local university sort of raising their hands and being like, well, I have school tomorrow, so I don't think taking the park today is really conducive with my schedule. And, so this individualism, it really starts to sink in, and it can really, that bourgeois subjectivity, if we don't understand it in ourselves and try to root it out of ourselves and then try to explain to others how to root it out, that really will have consequences down the line. And so this ideological thing really becomes a mechanism by which collective strength, which is all we have, is our numbers. They have all the money and the guns and the militaries and the power, right? All we have is our numbers. So if we take individualism on board, then our core strength, our numbers, is then undermined by those numbers, that this big social block of a collective of people fighting for individual or for a cause, that breaks down, and all of a sudden it's not a big block of collective anymore. It's a bunch of little individuals with their own little petty concerns and whatnot, and that does serious damage to any movement, organization, etc.
I mean, there's very much a sort of polarization and a significant juxtaposition between the sort of the general sort of liberal ruling class Enlightenment focused philosophy that still is undergirds a lot of the ideology, or at least the philosophy behind the ideology of even modern capitalism, and even into Ayn Randian kind of really ridiculous American style right-wing libertarianism, which is always frustrating that word has been taken over by the American right wing, because I want to take it back for the left. But I think you still, the interesting thing, I think, and one of the things when I was reading the Utopian and Scientific book, was just the whole idea of this fundamental contradiction of the idea that in capitalism the owner feels individually justified to take the fruits of socialized labor, and that there's this contradiction that we all work in this, we all know about this socialized labor. We're all working together. No one individual can say that thing that is there is the thing that I made, except for the notion that the owner of the factory, by their right as owner, still retains this individualized the right of the essentially the profits. And so I think the the role that this individualism plays, it still very much undergirds even the very fundamental relationships in production in capitalism, and this ideological justification for the exploitation of the working class in terms of the takings of surplus value. But it also atomizes the working class itself and can be a way of, as you described, maintaining divisions within the working class such that it won't ever become united and conscious of itself as a class, which is the only way that it would ever be able to fundamentally contest the dynamics of and the ruling class of the sort of modern capitalist liberal bourgeois epoch of history. And so it's a double-edged sword in the fact that it makes those who are exploiting people feel justified in their exploitation, and it works directly against the ability for the people who need to join together to fight that exploitation to actually join together. And so in that sense, the ruling class ideology of which individualism is a core part is a very pernicious ideology for especially as we confront major issues in terms of the next major change in productive forces, which is automation and technology, and the role that that's going to play in. I mean, it's an amazing thing to see the potential of the ruling class in their drive for the individual taking of profits would actually destroy their ability to make profits by automating away the working class. That it's so deeply embedded in them of this right, this individual right to the proceeds of social production, that even not understanding the way the system actually works, they are going to drive themselves out of the ability to maintain their profit making. It's an amazing, the perniciousness of that ideology is really amazing, and it drives people to, destroy the environment and then claim that it's not happening.
Yeah,
exactly. It has consequences literally for the rest of the world, and for, as I guess Chomsky would say, organized life on planet Earth. And so it's the consequences of this ideology in the negative is serious and ridiculous.
Absolutely. Perfectly said. I mean, there's so much that you said that I could run with because it's all so great and completely on point. But I do want to just pull out, before we move on to the next question, this idea of free will and connect it up with ideology, because we talked earlier about ideology as a form of justifying itself. So what role does this belief in individual free will, which, I mean, scientifically speaking, or even thinking along Marxist lines, like we are very skeptical of this concept of free will, but it really is sort of a major part of bourgeois self-understanding and subjectivity. But what free will does, what role it actually plays at how it actually cashes out in society, is it allows you to justify the hierarchy of the haves and have-nots, and it allows you to assign moral blame to the poor for not doing the right things, because if everybody's endowed with free will, then your position on the social hierarchy is a product of your own free will and the way you chose to wield it. So if you're poor, you deserve to be poor, and if you're rich, you deserve to be rich. So even when you go into philosophy and you study free will, that will never be mentioned. It'll never be applied in that way. It'll just be like these abstract, does free will really exist? If so, where is it, etc. But the reason that it has such sort of cash in our society is precisely because it serves that ideological function, and it allows the hierarchy to maintain itself. So,
yeah, I mean, especially, having studied criminal law specifically, it undergirds the entire notion of American criminal law. The idea that that essentially, if you rewound everything back to the moment at which you quote unquote made the decision, you could make a different decision and things would go a different way. This very notion that has no real good philosophical grounding, it functions as a way of maintaining the prosecution of basically usually the working class and the consequences of capitalist production in terms of the destruction of the working class into anything from thievery, prostitution, and all kinds of essentially property crimes that are committed. And so there's this again, it's further evidence of this sort of pernicious role that the idea of like individuality and individual free will in particular plays in justifying the existent unnatural distribution of wealth, resources, abilities, talents, and the consequences thereof. And I think it's also fundamentally just not scientific, and it's coming up, especially as the interesting thing is, as self-serving to the system as science can tend to be, it also follows as production develops, it usually because of scientific development, and so science and technology are usually the things that cause the initial disruption in the change from one historical epoch to the next. And, we really are, it's been said for a long time, but as this technological boom is coming, we really are at the precipice of a new revolutionary period, whether we like it or not. And the question is really going to be, as we see the rise of like Andrew Yang and people like that who are talking about this potential destruction from automation and things like that, it's causing us to, the scientific advancements that come from that may also go directly against the prevailing, wisdom. And so as we understand the way that the brain functions, more and more we may, have less and less of reason to consider free will as something that we actually have, and so this will fit hopefully better into a sort of new critique of everything existing that we do need. Again, we sort of need a new, not necessarily a new Marx, but a new revival of the Marxist desire to critique everything existing, so that we can use modern science to interrogate and hopefully overcome some of these old and ridiculous ideas that have no longer any value.
Yeah, absolutely. I think of Andrew Yang as I called him recently a libertarian techno-accelerationist. And what Yang represents with his UBI program is the attempt by the bourgeoisie to find some way to allow for the continued existence of class society and the capitalist mode of production, even in light of the contradiction of automation eradicating the labor force. So it's like, okay, what do we do with all these workers? Well, okay, we still want to appropriate all the value and have all the power and wealth in our society. So maybe if we just cut them a check of $1,000 every month, that'll shut them up and they can play their video games and we can continue to amass all the wealth and the power. And so Yang isn't probably conscious of himself as filling that role. He doesn't think of himself as doing that. I'm sure he has like good intentions and shit, but that's how ideology operates. It doesn't need to be conscious, and most times it's not. And in fact, when it's most effective, it's not conscious at all by the people that are serving its interests.
Exactly, and that's where you get the benefit of the Chomsky's whole critique of media and the manufacturing of consent. That none of this isn't happening at the surface in a very conscious level. In many ways, sometimes it is conscious, and you'll have people who are blind ideologues, like Paul Ryan or something like that, who are blind ideologues who will quote Ayn Rand and then say that Rage Against the Machine is one of their favorite bands. So square that circle. But you have like Andrew Yang, especially to me, is amazing because it's the expression of a recognition of a fundamental contradiction, and then the desire for the capitalist class to maintain the dynamic, even though they know that in the end it's a futile effort. Like this is the acknowledgement of the last throes of the system as it is, and it's the sort of like, to me, a universal basic income is the last attempt to maintain the capitalist relationships of production, the capitalist mode of production itself, because it fundamentally doesn't take into account that thing that a Marxist insight that's incredible, which is you have to exploit human labor in order to generate actual profit. If you don't have that as part of the dynamic, you don't even generate the profit. And if the system is based on generating a profit, if you destroy the working class, you destroy the ability for the system to survive. And so to see it happening in real time is actually an amazing thing. And Andrew Yang is simply the sort of Pied Piper of the inevitable collapse of the system. And as much as people give shit for Marxists for talking about inevitability and using some of these kinds of words, as we've seen history go along, has it progressed exactly as Marx saw it? No. He wasn't a fortune teller. He was a guy presenting ideas and a perspective in terms of how to understand historical developments. And I think that they are, just as valid as they were back then, even though he's not a fortune teller. And we can see how the dynamics that he described, even as the end of feudalism, is happening in our particular period. And there's a warning in Marxism that says there's two possibilities when this situation presents itself. Either we have a revolution and a new class takes over and brings in a new historical epoch that relates to the new mode of production at the base of society, or the whole system goes under and collapses, and we have a new sort of Middle Ages. And when you have biotechnology and bioweapons like we have, nuclear weapons, and these kinds of and global climate change, these potentially world-destroying things, the destruction of merely the class dynamics is not merely the destruction of the class dynamics; it's the destruction of the entire race of humanity. Yeah. And so this is not. This is something that we shouldn't be taking lightly, that this is a serious warning. And Andrew Yang, as non-assuming as he is really, the canary in the coal mine of the looming disaster that is the consequence of, 300 years of capitalist development compared to the 100 or 150 years that even Marx saw.
Yeah, perfectly, beautifully said, my friend. I mean, I can't really add anything to that. I think that's very, very, very well said.
Yeah. All right. So, to kind of be mindful of your time, I wanna go back to sort of the reason behind the sort of podcasting and this desire to be an educator and to raise class consciousness. How do you see the situation that we're in now? You did mention, post 2008, there's been a bit of an awakening, but there's definitely been, I think there was a period of time after the 80s that we also talked about where, it was Francis Fukuyama's end of history, and that the ideological battle had actually ended, and that we were, on the way, and that there was not a lot of socialist organizing at that period and time. But now we see the rise of Bernie Sanders. So how do you view the situation?
Yeah, it's tough. I definitely view it as a sort of, like I always say, like this century is the crossroads of our species, precisely for the reason that you just said. Like either we successfully build a better world and before fucking time's up, or I think Marx put it, it'll result in the quote unquote common ruin of all contending classes, a form of barbarism, or perhaps some sort of eco-dystopia or fascism. Who's to say what exactly form it will take, but it will be barbaric and it will be horrible. And that's the sort of challenge of our time. And we have this horrific history of Cold War anti-communism. We have this so much power and wealth concentrated into the hands of the U.S. ruling class nationally, but just globally, smaller and smaller amounts of hands. I think like the richest 3 Americans own more wealth than the bottom 50%. Yeah. And like the top 5 or 6 richest human beings on planet Earth own more than the bottom 3.5 billion combined. Yeah. And so, I mean, we have to act. All we can do is in our local situation organize and do the best we can. It's really important to say that nothing is inevitable in the sense, like as you were saying, you can't just sit back and let the contradictions play out and it'll usher us into a new better world, right? The idea is that human beings are the sort of vehicle, the prism through which history flows. It's right. Our responsibility to rise to the task of our time, of our epoch. And, I think we're all trying to do that in our own ways. The contradictions will intensify. They will become more apparent. The far right will descend further and further as the contradictions intensify. They'll descend further and further into conspiratorial thinking and acts of mass violence and right-wing terrorism. The ruling class will become increasingly desperate to hold on to whatever power it has over the next century, and will use the state military power that it's been able to accrue over the last few centuries in the service, and police departments as well, in the service of maintaining control at all costs. And so that will require an understanding on the left and hyper organization, right? Like if we're going to take on the most organized, militant, well-funded organization in human history, i.e. the global bourgeoisie, we also have to be very, very organized. We have to have a very coherent program, a strategy that everybody in the organization follows. And that's going to require a lot of individual work to purge ourselves of our sort of conditioned liberalism and individualism. It's going to require us to teach ourselves as well as others constantly. And it's going to require us to constantly engage in organizing in whatever capacity we possibly can. Nothing is guaranteed, but I don't know about other people, but I'm certainly not going to like flip through Instagram while the world burns. I'm going to do something about it. I'm going to do my best. I have kids too. Like I have 2 kids.
Yeah.
So this shit is, it's their futures that's at stake. So I can never turn away from that and not rise to that challenge. So, I mean, that's the terrible situation we found ourselves in. But, I do want to say also, like, the ending of epochs can sometimes feel like the end of the world. And in this case, it very well might be the end of the world. Mm-hmm. But in previous epochs, I mean, just imagine the transition from feudalism to capitalism. It happened over centuries. It had countless civil wars and wars and uprisings and repressions by the monarchic, rulers, etc. For a lot of people at various times in that, it must have felt like the end of the world. Right. So, hope is not, we still have to have hope. We still have to do our best. And I'm cautiously optimistic that we'll find some way out of this. Like, I hope we don't go like absolutely, belly up and go extinct or something in the next 100 or 200 years, or more or less extinct. But it's impossible to predict. All we can do is try to sharpen our understanding and put our ideas into praxis and take responsibility for what it means to live at this time.
Yeah, I mean, I'm taking a lot of hope that you see things like Marx talked about in Teen Vogue and stuff. I think there's a lot of really good things that are going to come out of. I think after 2008, after Occupy and stuff like that, that really lit the fire, the embers of which helped Bernie Sanders feel like he had enough of a dynamic to run, and then the takeoff that happened with the amount of opening that of discussion that's been able to happen, to have, and you have even magazines as frustrating as they can be sometimes, like Jacobin, coming out with and being a force of, he's talking about from a more radical left perspective. You have these things that are not easily dismissible as they were. I mean, our
podcasts, right? That's
exactly.
As well. Yeah.
I mean, I remember when I was, I've been doing this almost 20 years now, and I remember, when being much younger, being in my late teens and saying, I'm a socialist, and people, I might as well have said that I wanted to cut their head off or something. Yeah. I mean, it was really, people were still very much afraid, and that Cold War mentality was really, pernicious. And I vaguely remember the sort of wall coming down and stuff like that. I was born in 85, so I was old enough to very vaguely remember that. And so, but I don't, it didn't scare me like it did, and it does my parents, and it won't scare my kid, nearly in the way. I mean, he'll be raised in red diapers, so I guess that'll be something. But it'll be a little bit easier, I guess. But I mean, when you see, I think things like Teen Vogue and even the climate thing, I think that is really going to light a literal and figurative fire under the asses of an entire generation. And I may not, and you may not be part of that generation, but we will benefit from what I see their activism being at least more open to these ideas of capitalism and a critique of capitalism and the role of class and the ability of that to be an analysis that can propel them to understand what is really necessary to combat the climate issue and among the other issues like inequality, war, and some of those other kinds of things. Yeah,
absolutely. A big Marxist idea is like, regardless of what like sort of subtendency you are on the Marxist side, we don't believe that, we just need to get together and then we create the revolution. It's like, revolutions occur when there's certain conditions that hold. And the job of Marxists or radicals is to prepare for when that event comes. Like Lenin said, there are decades when nothing happens and there are weeks when decades happen. Yeah. And you have to be ready for it. And so this climate change, I mean, we, at the very least with us, in our epoch, we get, several years of seeing this thing come closer and closer. We have time to act, and we know that when it comes and it arrives in more and more intensity, that it's going to force people to choose a side. It's going to force people out of their complacency. And when you look even at Americans, right? Americans, they can hear ideas and everything, and a recession sucks, but for the vast majority of Americans to really be shaken out of their sort of ideological slumber, it will take many Americans becoming uncomfortable in a way that they've never become uncomfortable, materially uncomfortable. And, who knows what will happen when that happens. But for one thing's for sure, it does not mean that most people are going to go to the side of the capitalist. And I would even say that most people hopefully won't go to the side of the fascist. They will start looking for alternatives, and we have to be there with open arms and willing to bring them in. And part of the things that we can do right now to work towards that is like mutual aid disaster relief, what they do, which is, as these storms continue and as hurricanes and tornadoes and floods and droughts devastate people, when it's communists and socialists and anarchists that are showing up and making sure that, you're fed and that you have food and that your kids are taken care of, that will speak more to the average working class person than 100 hours of my podcast, So that's really important to remember going forward. People are going to be forced to look for alternatives, and we have to be ready to embrace them.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to, I wanted to ask you sort of how you see the role of your podcast in terms of educating people. But I think, I think it was Ingalls who said, 1 pound of theory is worth 1,000 pounds of action, I think it is, or something like that, like the idea that like theory is important, and it's really important that we have a platform or the ability to talk about these ideas and talk to each other and those kind of things, which I think your podcast and my podcast is attempting to do and get out this information. But as you also said, one of the most important and impactful things that happens in people's lives is when you're actually there for them. When you show up on the picket line, when you go to an eviction defense, when you go to a court hearing for somebody who's been arrested protesting, those things are things that actually matter and make a difference to the lives of everyday working class people. And if you do that kind of activity and you do it as an open Marxist, or communist, or socialist, that tends to do a lot to change the minds of individuals who may have, in their, as far as all they know, never met a socialist, never met a communist, and now somebody's coming up and actually, help it out and not telling them what to do and letting them, lead when it's their fight and helping them out when they need the help. That can be incredibly impactful.
Absolutely. It's so impactful, and that is really how you change minds. And we see that with organizing. We see that like with tenant organizers. A big story that came out was like they helped this guy get his $500 deposit back, and this guy was so inspired by the help that these random communists lent him that he turned around and started becoming an organizer, helping other people in his tenants. And the basic idea was like, I didn't know much about communism or socialism or any of that, but when I was in trouble, it was the communists and the socialists that showed up for me. And while I don't know what all these words necessarily mean and why I couldn't sit here and give you a dissertation on what socialism is, I know that these are the people that had my back when it mattered most. And he's like, so I'm going to turn around and support them. And that's what it's all about.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's nothing better for somebody who's involved in these kinds of things. It can be very lonely. It can be very frustrating. As you had said, before, the idea Marxism is a very large set of ideas, and you can study it your whole life and never consider yourself an expert. But when you can easily recognize when somebody has your back, and if that person's a socialist, that may be all that you need to know about what it means to be a socialist.
Absolutely.
All right, man. You know what? I think like it was an amazing chance to get to talk to you and about this important thing. I want to make sure there isn't anything else that you didn't want to mention that we didn't cover before we go. But before we do, it's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you. I'm really glad we got this set up that you randomly came across, my podcast. I would encourage anybody who listens to mine, if you hear my podcast and you don't know about Revolutionary Left Radio, you got to go to that one because you probably won't come back, and that's fine with me. But I don't know, anything else that you want to mention or let everybody know about how they can find, Rev Left Radio?
If you want to find us, you can just go to revolutionaryleftradio.com. It has both our shows. But yeah, I also just want to say, like, thank you so much for having me on. I love your show. It's really funny to see that we knew each other before either of us had a show, that we come together and discover each other through them. It's been a blast. I think we covered a lot of hopefully important topics here, and I would love to collaborate with you in the future, maybe have you on Rev Left and keep this sort of collaboration going, because it's important and I love talking to you. So
absolutely, man. It's been a pleasure talking to you, and it's I enjoyed talking with you when it was just digitally, and I guess it's still technically somewhat digitally, but it's good to hear your voice, and I really enjoy the podcast. I think it's cool that you're doing the more podcast and creating more content while still taking care of the family and doing all that kind of stuff. That's all really important work. So thanks for everything that you do. I'll direct everybody to Rev Left on the post for this page, but I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much, my friend. Solidarity.
All right, brother.